He held the shaking alien child, while the High Council watched without a word. The sky had been the color of ash for 11 months. Sergeant Dara Voss remembered what blue looked like. She kept a photograph in her breast pocket, folded into quarters, her daughter Anna at the lake outside Reykjavik, 4 years old, squinting into a sun that no longer reached the surface of the earth with anything like warmth. She had not looked at the photograph in 3 weeks, not because she'd forgotten Anna, because she was afraid that one day she would unfold it and feel nothing, and that would mean the last human thing in her had finally gone quiet. The transit camp at Keldure Station had started as a processing point for the refugee convoys moving north. That had been 8 months ago. Now it was a city, 40,000 people sheltering under prefab panels and stretched canvas, burning anything combustible, eating whatever the UN logistics convoys managed to push through the Vatnajökull corridor before the road iced over. Dara ran the eastern perimeter with 11 soldiers, 4 of whom were not soldiers at all, a school teacher named Bram, a plumber named Kofi, a 16-year-old girl named Petra who had simply shown up one morning with a rifle and a look that made it unwise to question her. They kept the perimeter. They kept the peace, more or less. Nobody talked about what had started it. The war had lasted 9 days. The aftermath had lasted, well, the aftermath was still happening. The ash clouds had come from the firestorms, and the firestorms had come from the strikes, and the strikes had come from a cascade of miscalculation so perfectly stupid that historians, the few who remained, working by candlelight in whatever building still held roofs, could not agree on who had blinked first. It didn't matter. The firestorms seeded the stratosphere with soot that blocked between 30 and 40% of solar radiation at the surface. Temperatures dropped. Crops failed at scale. The supply chains that had fed 8 billion people folded in the span of a growing season, the way a house of cards collapses, not slowly, not partially, but all at once. Dara had been stationed outside Oslo when the first strikes came. She had driven her unit south toward the coast, and then north again when south became impossible, and eventually she had ended up here, at the edge of the habitable zone, watching the perimeter of a camp that smelled of wood smoke and wet canvas, and the particular sour milk scent of too many bodies in too small a space. She did not think about what Oslo looked like now. She thought about the perimeter. The morning the Ashar came, she was eating a cup of reconstituted potato soup at the checkpoint tent when Kofi put a hand on her arm without speaking. She looked up. He was pointing north, past the wire, into the gray-brown murk that passed for weather these days. Something was coming down. She had seen footage of their ships before. Everyone had, by then, the feeds from the first contact event in Johannesburg, 7 weeks before the war. The Ashar had not started the war. That was a common misconception. The Ashar had simply arrived, and the sight of them, their long spiral-hulled vessels descending through clouds above a southern African city, the confirmation that humanity was not alone and had not been alone for some time, had accelerated the paranoia that had already been building between the old powers. The war was human-made, human-fueled, human-ended. The Ashar had watched it from orbit. What they thought about what they had watched, no one knew. Their diplomatic delegation had landed outside Brussels 3 months ago and been received with the frantic, hollow courtesy of governments that had just watched their infrastructure collapse. The official communiques were polite and said nothing. The Ashar High Council, 5 beings whose titles translated roughly as arbiters of civilizational continuity, had established a forward observation station 20 kilometers from Keldure. They had not interfered. They had not offered aid. They had observed. The ship that came down that morning was not a diplomatic vessel. It was small scout class, Dara decided, based on the wing configuration she'd seen in the intelligence briefings. It came down badly, clipping the ridge line to the northwest and leaving a gray-black gouge in the frozen basalt before grinding to a stop 800 meters from the wire. She was already moving, already pulling on her gear, already calling it in. Voss to command. We have a hard landing northwest bearing scout-class Ashar vessel, requesting instructions. The radio crackled for a long time. Command to Voss, hold position, do not approach. Ashar liaison has been contacted. She stopped. She looked at the wreck. A thin column of dark smoke was rising from the forward section. She said understood, then she kept walking toward it. Bram fell in beside her without being asked. He was a 43-year-old geography teacher who had survived 3 months of road travel from central Germany with a bad knee and a paperback copy of a Simon novel he had read 6 times. He had never fired a rifle in his life before 8 months ago. He carried one now with the awkward diligence of someone who had decided competence mattered more than comfort. Command said hold position, he said. I heard them. We're not holding position. Nope. He thought about this for a moment. All right, he said and kept walking. The ship had come down in a shallow depression between 2 ridgelines. The landing struts had sheared off and the hull had buckled along the port seam, but the forward compartment was intact. Dara could smell the Ashar before she reached the hatch. They had a smell, a mineral and ammonia composite, that the intelligence briefings had described as analogous to cold volcanic stone. She found the emergency release on the hatch by the schematic she'd been required to memorize 3 months ago, in case of exactly this kind of thing, and pulled it. The inner atmosphere vented with a flat hiss. She waited 3 seconds, then pulled herself up and through. There were 2 Ashar inside. One was clearly dead. It had been thrown against the forward console when the ship hit the ridge. The impact had done what impact does. It was large. The Ashar were large, 6 feet tall at the shoulder joint with a body plan that was not quite upright and not quite horizontal, something between a praying mantis and a long-limbed great ape, covered in a tight-fibered material that was part skin and part something else, a sensory integument that Dara had read about but never seen up close. The dead one was still. The smell in the compartment was stronger now, cold stone, ammonia, and something beneath it that she didn't have a word for. The second Ashar was alive. It was small. It took her a moment to understand what she was seeing. The Ashar High Council had appeared as adults in all the documentation, all the footage, all the diplomatic exchanges. Nobody had mentioned, or nobody had thought to ask, whether they brought their children. The small Ashar was perhaps the equivalent of a young child, if the scale of development she'd read about held. It was crouched in the rear of the cabin, pressed against the curved wall, with both its upper limbs drawn across its body in the posture the briefing had identified as defensive terrified. It was shaking. The shaking was full body, a fine tremor she could see even from across the cabin, the way you could see a candle flame moving without feeling the draft. Its 4 eyes, arranged in a lateral band across the head, were open and fixed on her. She put her rifle down. She put it down deliberately and stepped away from it and held up both hands, palms forward, in the human gesture of non-threat that she did not know the Ashar used or understood. The child shook. She crouched down slowly, making herself smaller, and sat cross-legged on the deck of the wrecked cabin, 2 meters from the child, and did not move. Bram appeared in the hatch behind her. She heard him stop when he saw what was inside. "Holy God," he said quietly. "Go back to the perimeter. Get Petra to seal the wire on the north side. Get the camp medic, Dr. Hansen. Tell her I need her at the wreck. Don't tell command anything specific yet. Tell them I'm assessing." A pause. The Ashar liaison. "We'll be here in 20 minutes. I've got maybe 15. Go." His footsteps receded. She turned back to the child. It was still shaking. The trembling had not lessened. If anything, it had deepened in the minutes since the hatch opened. She thought about shock. She thought about how shock felt, the dissociation of it, the sense of the body continuing to function while the mind went somewhere quiet and dark to wait. She had been in shock twice in her life. Once in Oslo, the night of the first strikes. Once 3 years before that, on a road outside Kandahar, when the vehicle ahead of hers went over a pressure plate. Both times, what had helped was a voice. Not words particularly. Just a voice, steady and present, a signal that whatever had happened, something was still here. She began to talk. She talked about Anna. She talked about the photograph in her breast pocket and the lake outside Reykjavik, and the way Anna had shrieked when the water turned out to be cold even in July. She talked about the soup she'd been eating when the ship came down, and how reconstituted potato soup was one of the sadder things about the end of the world. She talked about Bram and his Simon novel, and how he'd explained the entire plot of it to her 3 separate times, each time as if it were new information. She talked quietly, in a low, even register, not trying to communicate information, but simply to fill the silence with the sound of a living being who was not afraid. The child's trembling slowed. Not stopped, but slowed. It made a sound, a low, clicking trill that she didn't have a translation for. The briefing materials covered formal diplomatic language. They had not covered what an Ashar child sounded like when it was frightened. She said, I know, it's okay. She moved very slowly, 3 inches forward on the deck. The child did not pull back. She moved again, another 3 inches. She could see its integument now up close, the fine fiber of it, the way it caught what little light came through the cracked ports. Its body plan was not like a human child's. There was no particular feature on its face that corresponded to what she would call an expression, but something in the set of its limbs, the angle of its head, communicated a state she recognized. It was alone, and it was hurt, and it didn't know if anyone was coming. She moved close enough to reach it without stretching, and then she sat still again and waited. After a minute, one of the small upper limbs uncurled from its defensive position and rested, tentatively, on her knee. She didn't move. The child leaned slowly, with the particular exhausted capitulation of something that has been frightened for too long, and pressed against her side. She put her arm around it. She could feel its trembling through her jacket, the fine motor shuddering of shock. She held it the way she would have held Anna, not tight, just present, her arm saying, Here, I am here, nothing more is coming for you right now. She started humming, an old Icelandic lullaby her grandmother had sung. She didn't know if the Ashar had music. She didn't know if any frequency she produced meant anything to the child's sensory apparatus. She hummed anyway. The trembling slowed further. Dr. Hansen arrived 14 minutes later, pulled herself up through the hatch, took in the situation in about 2 seconds, and sat down on the other side of the child without saying anything. She was a 60-year-old trauma surgeon who had left a career in Stockholm to spend a decade running field clinics in conflict zones before ending up at Keldur. She did not startle easily. She assessed the child the way she assessed everything, with her eyes, methodically, cataloging before touching. The other one, she said. No. A pause. How long has it been conscious? Since I entered. 12 minutes now. The shaking has reduced. Yes. Hansen sat with them. She did not reach for the child. She simply added another warm body to the group, another signal that the space was stable, that presence was possible. The Ashar liaison arrived 4 minutes after that. He was tall, taller than she expected, though she had seen the diplomatic footage, and the Ashar were always larger in person than they appeared on screens. His name, in the transliterated form that humans could approximate, was Sethavoran. He was the lead translator for the High Council's forward station, and when he pulled himself through the hatch and saw the tableau on the deck of the wrecked cabin, the human soldier with her arm around the Ashar child, the doctor on the other side, all 3 of them still, he stopped so completely that for a moment Dara thought he had been struck by something. He said something in Ashar, a long sequence, low-toned, formal. The child responded. Its voice had changed, no longer the clicking trill of fear, but something layered and quick, with what sounded like questions at the end. Sethovoran answered it. His voice was careful, she thought, calibrated. Then he looked at her. The Ashar face was difficult to read. She had spent 3 months trying to learn the indicators and still missed most of them. But the set of his head, the particular stillness of his upper limbs, she had learned that one. It meant, I am processing something I did not anticipate. The child, he said. In English, his English was precisely accented and always formal, a formal language learned from formal sources. You held the child. I did. The adult with the child it was. I'm sorry, yes. Another of those complete stillnesses. Then, the child has given your name in approximation. It is asking if you will remain. She looked at the child, which had not entirely let go of her side despite Sethovoran's presence. I'll remain, she said. The evacuation of the child took 3 hours. During those 3 hours, Dara learned several things. The child's name in approximate transliteration was Vethari. It was the offspring of the dead adult, a diplomat from the Ashar scholastic caste, traveling with the observation station as a secondary attaché. The crash had been caused by a failure in the ship's guidance system, a cascade fault, Sethovoran explained, that had been caused by particulate interference in the upper atmosphere. The ash clouds, the soot from the firestorms. The consequences of the war that the Ashar had watched from orbit without moving, 11 months ago. She did not say what she thought about that. She focused on Vethari. They had rigged a stretcher from equipment in the ship's emergency locker. The child was injured, a fracture in one of the mid-limb structures, and bruising across its integument that showed as darker patches, the Ashar equivalent of contusion. Dr. Hansen splinted the fracture using techniques she improvised on the fly, consulting with Sethovoran for every touch, asking before and after each intervention. The child bore it with a focused stillness that struck Dara as profoundly brave. She held its hand through all of it, or rather she maintained contact, her hand against the small upper limb while Hansen worked, a steady pressure, here. When they moved Vethari onto the stretcher, the child made a sound, the same clicking trill, but sharper, distressed, and its limb tightened on Dara's hand. I'm here, Dara said. I'm coming with you. I've got you. She didn't know if the words translated. She kept walking alongside the stretcher anyway, her hand in the child's grip. They brought Vethari to the camp's medical station. Command was waiting at the wire, Colonel Faber, stiff and pale, flanked by 2 aides who looked like they had been awake for 30 hours processing implications. The High Council's liaison vehicle was parked outside the main gate, its hull catching the gray light. Dara walked past Faber without stopping. Voss, Faber said. Bringing a wounded child to medical, she said. Brief me after. She heard him not respond, which was its own kind of answer. In the medical station, which was a converted prefab with 6 beds and a generator that ran 8 hours a day, they settled Vethari onto a pallet. Sethovoran had contacted the High Council's station. He had not said much about what they'd communicated back. He stood near the door and translated when the child asked questions, and was quiet the rest of the time. Dara sat beside the pallet. She had taken her jacket off at some point during the evacuation process. She was in her field shirt, her sergeant's tabs slightly bent from where the jacket collar had pushed against them. She had a cup of the camp's terrible instant coffee that someone had put in her hand without asking. She drank it. Vethari slept, eventually. The click trill of distress slowed and softened and disappeared, and the small body on the pallet settled into the particular architecture of sleep. Even the Ashar, she thought, had something that looked like that. She watched the child sleep. She thought about what she knew about the Ashar High Council. What she knew, 5 beings of the deliberation caste, the equivalents of judges or elders or some compound of both. They made decisions about how the Ashar engaged with other civilizations. They had watched humanity conduct a nuclear war and did nothing. Not because they were cruel, or so the diplomatic briefings maintained. Because the Ashar doctrine of civilizational non-interference was foundational, ancient, and treated almost as sacred law. You do not intervene in the choices of another species. You observe, and you document, and you allow what happens to happen, and afterward you reassess your classification of that civilization's viability. Viability. That was the word the briefings used. The Ashar were deciding whether humanity was viable, whether it was worth the Ashar's continued engagement, or whether the correct course was to withdraw and let the aftermath of the war proceed to its natural conclusion. A conclusion that, without significant external assistance, was going to involve the deaths of a very large number of people in the years ahead. The crops were failing. The distribution networks were gone. The ash layer was not going to clear for another 12 to 18 months at minimum. The High Council was watching to see if humanity was worth saving. She sat beside the sleeping Ashar child and drank her terrible coffee, and did not think about what they had decided. The High Council arrived 3 hours after Vithari was settled. They came in their formal vehicle, a large, low-slung transport with the High Council's insignia along its hull, a spiraling arrangement of marks that the briefings had described as the Ashar symbol for continuity and judgment. They were met at the gate by Colonel Faber, who straightened himself into the best posture of a man trying to represent a civilization under significant strain. They came into the medical station without preamble. 5 of them filing through the door. They were all of the adult Ashar height and build, the distinctive forward lean of the torso, the 4 lateral eyes, the complex sensory integument in shades of pale gray and deep brown. They arranged themselves around the room in no pattern she could immediately identify. Sethovorin, near the door, became very still. They looked at the child on the pallet. They looked at Dara. One of them spoke. Sethovorin translated in a murmur. The arbiter of first contact asks who you are and what your relationship is to the child. Sergeant Dara Voss. I was the first to reach the wreck. The child was in shock. I held it until the shock passed. Sethovorin translated. The arbiter responded, a long sequence. The arbiter says, why? She looked at the arbiter, a tall figure whose integument was almost entirely pale gray, which the briefings indicated was associated with age. Its eyes were on her face with the complete attention of something used to being the most significant presence in any room. The child was alone and hurt, she said. I know what that feels like. I didn't want it to feel that way. Translation, response. The arbiter asks, why does it matter whether a child of another species feels distress? And there it was, the question that was not really about Vithari. She thought about Oslo. She thought about the road outside Kandahar. She thought about the photograph of Anna at the lake, folded into quarters in her breast pocket. She thought about the 40,000 people outside, sheltering in canvas and prefab panels, burning anything combustible, eating whatever came through the corridor. Because, she said, it doesn't occur to me to let a child suffer when I can do something about it. It doesn't matter what kind of child. It doesn't matter if I'll see it again or if it belongs to a civilization that's been watching mine fail without stepping in. It's a child. It's frightened and hurt and alone. You help it. You hold it until the shaking stops. That's the answer. She was aware as she said it that her voice was level. She was not angry. She was not performing anything. She was simply saying the true thing, the way you said true things when you had been running on too little sleep and too little food and too much terrible coffee for 11 months, with a flatness that was not coldness but exhaustion, the weariness of someone who had run out of the energy to be anything other than direct. Sethovorin translated. The silence that followed was not the silence of an empty room. It was the silence of something being processed. The pale arbiter spoke again, longer this time. The other 4 were perfectly still. She had the sense, she could not have explained it, that something was shifting in the room. Sethovorin's translation came slowly. The Arbiter says, "The Council has observed your species for 11 months. The Council has observed it for 40 years prior, in preparation. The Council has seen your capacity for organized violence on a scale that most would classify as terminal civilizational failure. The doctrine of non-interference exists because civilizations in the process of terminal failure do not benefit from external intervention. The resources of the Ashar have value. They are not deployed where the deployment cannot recover the investment." He paused. She waited. The Arbiter says, "The Council has been deliberating your classification for 3 months. The deliberation has been, the translation is approximate, contested. There are those on the Council who regard the 11-month evidence as sufficient to complete the classification. There are those who have argued for an extension of the observation period. Both positions have merit within the doctrine." Another pause. The Arbiter says, "I have watched 17 civilizations undergo contact events. Not all survived. The ones that did not survive had certain markers in common. The Council uses these markers as classification indicators. One of the markers is this: what a species does with a child that is not its own, under conditions of extreme civilizational stress, with nothing to gain." The room was very quiet. The Arbiter says, "We did not expect to have occasion to observe this marker under field conditions in this station today." Dara looked at Vethari on the pallet. The child was awake now, had woken at some point in the last few minutes. Its 4 eyes were open and fixed on the Arbiter's, with what she had learned to read as the Ashar version of careful attention. She looked back at the pale Arbiter. "The child needed holding," she said. "That's all." The Arbiter spoke once more. Sethovorin translated without a pause. The Arbiter says, "Yes, and your species is still here." What happened next unfolded over weeks and months, and the telling of it would require more time than this account has space for: the logistics conferences, the resource allocation meetings, the careful, painstaking work of building the framework through which the Ashar began to offer material support to the human recovery effort. Not charity, exactly. The Ashar did not use that concept. Their doctrine had no word for unearned resource transfer. What they offered was categorized, in the formal communiques, as provisional civilizational support contingent on ongoing viability assessment. What it amounted to in practice was food cultivation technology adapted for low solar conditions, atmospheric remediation techniques that accelerated the clearing of the soot layer, medical knowledge that had taken the Ashar 3 centuries to develop, and that Dr. Hansen spent 4 months learning alongside a team of Ashar technical advisors. The ash layer cleared in 8 months, not 12. The first season of adapted crops produced enough to begin drawing down the camps. None of this appeared in any single document, or was announced in any single communique. It accumulated, the way recovery accumulates, not in dramatic reversals but in small daily increments, in the particular stubbornness of people who have decided to keep going. Dara remained at Keldur for another 14 months after the crash. She saw Vethari 3 more times during that period. The first time was a formal occasion, a diplomatic exchange at the High Council station, which she attended in her dress uniform, which she had not worn since Oslo. Vethari was recovering well. The mid-limb fracture had healed. The child moved through the Ashar station with the ease of someone who belonged there. But when it saw Dara across the reception room, it made the clicking trill, not the frightened version. She had learned to hear the difference, and came across to her with a directness that the adult Ashar in the room tracked with what she had come to recognize as surprised interest. It stood next to her for most of the reception. She stood next to it. The second time was less formal. Sethovorin brought the child to the medical station to visit Dr. Hansen, who had by that point become something of a fixture at the Ashar technical collaboration sessions. Dara was there running a supply audit. Vethari found her among the shelves and sat with her while she counted stock, which took 45 minutes, and said nothing except the occasional series of clicks that Sethivorin translated afterward from the doorway as, "It is a companionable silence." The third time was the last day before Dara's transfer. She had been reassigned to the Reconstruction Coordination Office in what remained of Reykjavik, a logistical role, managing the distribution networks for the northern sector, the kind of work that happened in buildings rather than at wire perimeters. She was leaving in the morning. Vethari came to the wire alone, which was unusual enough that Petra almost stopped it before recognizing who it was. It stood at the wire and waited until someone found Dara. She came to the wire in her field jacket, with the transfer orders in her pocket and her gear already packed. They stood on either side of the wire. Vethari was taller than the first time she'd seen it. The Ashar developed fast in the year after infancy, the briefings had noted. It was still small for its age by Ashar standards, but it was no longer shaking, and the set of its limbs was the one she had learned to associate with composure. It spoke, a long sequence, more formal than anything she'd heard from it before. She looked back at Sethivorin, who had followed at a distance. He translated. "The child says, 'I was alone and you came into the dark place and you held me until the shaking stopped.' The Ashar have a word, it does not translate precisely. The nearest English rendering would be, 'the one who holds in the dark.' It is an old word. It is used for, your word might be guardian, but the connotation is more specific. It is the guardian who comes without being asked and stays without being thanked and expects no debt in return." Dara looked at Vethari. "I didn't stay without being thanked," she said. "You stayed with me in the supply room for 45 minutes while I counted instant coffee packets." Sethivorin relayed this. Vethari made the clicking trill, the companionable one. Then it reached through the wire and put its small upper limb on her hand for a moment, the same gesture, she realized, as that first moment in the wrecked cabin when it had reached out and rested its limb on her knee. A testing of weight. A finding out if the ground would hold. She covered its hand with her other hand. The wire was cold between them. The sky above was still gray, lighter than it had been, a pearl gray now instead of ash, the first signs of the clearing they'd been told to expect. You could almost, if you looked at the horizon at the right time of morning, find a shade of color that was trying very hard to be blue. She held the child's hand through the wire for a moment. Then she let go and picked up her bag and walked toward the transport that was waiting to take her north. She did not look back, not because she had forgotten Vethari. Because some things you carry forward rather than behind. The weight of them distributed across your whole body, the way a good pack is balanced so that you can walk long distances without your back breaking. In Reykjavik, at the coordination office, she found a window facing east and put the photograph of Anna on the frame, unfolded, face out. The lake was still there. Anna was still squinting into the sun. The sun was coming back. It was thin yet, thin and pale and filtered through a sky that still carried the residue of what humans had done to each other. But it reached the window each morning, and each morning the light it cast was incrementally less gray, and she stood in it for a few minutes while the coffee brewed, before the day's work started. Bram was in Reykjavik too, retired from perimeter duty to work as a consultant on the agricultural adaptation teams. He appeared at the coordination office one evening with a bottle of something that was not quite wine and 2 cups and the Simon novel, which he had now read 9 times. They sat at her desk and drank the not quite wine while he explained the plot to her again. Outside the window, the eastern sky was doing something she had not seen in a long time. It was turning a color that was recognizably, unmistakably, stubborn, undeniable blue. She did not cry. She was too tired to cry. She just sat there and looked at it and let it be true and thought about holding things in the dark until the shaking stopped. It was, she decided, enough. It was, in fact, the most specifically human thing she knew how to do, and she had done it, and it had mattered, and the sky was turning blue. The High Council's formal reclassification of humanity, from terminal viability assessment to provisional stability, was issued 3 weeks later in a communiqué that ran to 47 pages, and which almost no one read in full. The summary paragraph, which was circulated widely, contained a phrase that the translators spent 2 days trying to render precisely before settling on the best available approximation. The observed species demonstrates, under conditions of extreme civilizational stress, a behavioral pattern not catalogued in prior contact documentation. This pattern is defined as the extension of protective presence to vulnerable individuals beyond the observer's species boundary, with no strategic calculus apparent and no expectation of reciprocal benefit. The Council notes this pattern as anomalous within its classification framework, and notes further that the framework may require revision. The reclassification to provisional stability is issued on the basis of this observation, and is understood to reflect not the capacity of this species to destroy, which is documented and is considerable, but the capacity of this species to, against all evident statistical incentive, hold. Nobody at the coordination office had a printer that worked reliably, so Dara read the communiqué on a borrowed tablet and then passed it back. She went to the window. The sky was blue. She hummed the old lullaby her grandmother had sung, just a few bars under her breath, for no particular audience. Then she went back to work.